kasih sudah klik video ini. Tapi jangan lupa guys, klik tombol subscribe karena subscribe itu gratis. Dengan subscribe kamu support channel ini terus untuk upload hampir setiap hari. Ingat, subscribe itu gratis, gak ada ruginya kamu klik tombol subscribe guys. Selamat menonton, enjoy!
Around 25 years after the death of Jesus Christ, the movement he had inspired split into two factions. These factions held very different views of their leader, his identity, his message, his vision. A power struggle ensued, and one of these factions, under the guiding genius of St. Paul, emerged the winner. Eventually, it wrote its version of Jesus' story in the Gospels of the New Testament. The other faction is more mysterious. It left behind no surviving record of its beliefs and withered away. Yet unlike the winners who wrote the Gospels, this faction was composed of the people who really knew Jesus, his family, and his disciples. What if they had won the power struggle and written their alternative biography of Jesus? What sort of person would Jesus be if his life story had been told by those who knew him best? Jerusalem, a city divided by religion. Somewhere in this city nearly 2,000 years ago, the leading members of a revolutionary Jewish-led movement gathered for a crucial summit meeting. The meeting would be the final showdown in a long-running rift between the movement's two key figures. One of these men was called Paul. He'd been born in Turkey of wealthy Jewish parents and trained as a rabbi in Jerusalem. It would later emerge that he was also a citizen of the Roman Empire, which at this time occupied Palestine.
Paul can be seen as a very sophisticated, cosmopolitan person familiar with the overseas world of imperial Rome, well-traveled, well-educated, master of Greek rhetoric, someone who is sophisticated.
The second key figure going to the summit remains one of the most mysterious people in the whole story of Christianity. His name was James, and he had become the most important person in the Jesus movement.
James, everyone accepts, was the brother of Jesus. In the Gospels and the book of Acts, James does not appear anywhere during the lifetime of Jesus, and yet suddenly he blossoms out as the leader of the Jesus movement after Jesus' death.
What sort of person was James? The Gospels mention that Jesus had 4 brothers, of whom James was probably the eldest, but they say little else. However, from other documents, it seems clear that James could hardly have been a greater contrast to the worldly sophisticate Paul. Jesus' family were poor and probably illiterate. They were also strict Jews, keenly observant of Jewish law, and no one seems to have been stricter than Jesus' brother, James.
James comes through as wearing threadbare clothes, as being poor and law-oriented, the epitome of the extreme purity-conscious, zealot-type Jewish groups.
Later documents speak very highly of James. In fact, he was so pious, he used to pray every day on his knees, it said, till his knees became like camels' knees.
After Jesus' death, James had become head of the Jesus movement in Jerusalem, the Jerusalem Church as it became known. But away from Jerusalem, Paul had his visionary encounter with the risen Christ on the road to Damascus. Up until then, Paul had been a persecutor of Christ's followers. But now, he became one of their leaders, and a man with a view of Jesus which directly conflicted with James. Their differences were fundamental. They included Jesus' birth, his message, and above all, whether or not he was divine. Today, the followers of Christ take for granted the Gospel's view that Jesus was the Son of God who died on the cross to save mankind. This is the version reenacted every Good Friday by Christians in Jerusalem. But in the years just after Jesus' death, the question of exactly who he was highly contentious. The ensuing battle between Paul and James to resolve that question would decide what version of Jesus was handed down to posterity. The losers would be viewed as heretics and written out of the history altogether. The dispute began because Paul believed that he, and not Jesus' family or disciples, had been given the truth about Jesus, even though Paul had never known Jesus himself.
He claimed he knew more about Jesus than they did because he was communing not with the lifetime Jesus, who perhaps was a bit difficult to understand, but with the heavenly Jesus who came to him and gave him instructions and information from heaven. And the heavenly Jesus was a better source of information, according to Paul, than the actual historical earthly Jesus.
Paul would represent a later foreign interloper within this movement, to some extent, who hijacked the movement.
The evidence of how the battle between Paul and James unfolded can be gleaned from hints and references in Paul's own letters and the Acts of the Apostles. The rift began because of Paul's determination that, having once oppressed Christians, he would now spread his version of Christ's message to all men, including non-Jews, throughout the world.
He began missions in 4 provinces of the Roman Empire and made a great success of them with groups of churches in each place. And as soon as he began to be a success, the Jerusalem people were behind him, trying to force his churchmen back into their way of thinking.
James came to believe that Paul was diluting Jesus' message by allowing non-Jews to join the movement without insisting that they observe Jewish law. One issue was eating kosher food. To James, this was essential. He believed that the Jesus movement, and Jesus himself, were strictly Jewish, and new members had to respect the rules. Another divisive issue was whether, like Jesus himself, non-Jewish recruits had to be circumcised.
Now, the trouble is, of course, when you actually say to people, would you like to become a Christian, they may think, what a marvelous thing. But if you say, well, the next thing is, we've got a knife here, they're not perhaps so keen on it.
As Paul himself wrote, the disputes between him and James had first come to a head around 50 AD, when James sent emissaries led by the Apostle Peter to confront him in the Syrian city of Antioch. James's message to Paul was that non-Jewish members must eat kosher food if they were with Jews. Paul was furious.
Paul describes them as having been brought in secretly to spy out our freedom which we have in Christ Jesus. False brethren, he calls them. He's very aggressive about it.
The gunfire from this debate is almost deafening. In fact, 2 Corinthians, Paul launches into a diatribe of self-pity, where he describes all the wounds, all the suffering he has undergone, and finally begins to talk about his arch enemies, whom he calls the pillars of the church, the super apostles, the apostles of the highest degree.
Eventually, to stop the movement splitting, Paul persuaded James to agree a compromise. The Jesus movement would remain a fundamentally Jewish one, but Paul's non-Jewish recruits could join without having to be circumcised or eat kosher food. The years passed with two separate missions. Paul continued to export his message to non-Jews throughout the Roman Empire, and he promised not to interfere with James and the Jerusalem church's mission to Jews. But then, James began to hear an alarming new story about Paul. So it was that around 58 AD, James summoned Paul to Jerusalem. Their summit meeting would be the endgame in the rift which had beleaguered the Jesus movement ever since Paul had joined it. It would decide the future of Christianity and what version of Jesus' life would prevail. Paul was carrying a donation from his missions, but would it be enough to appease James?
This is the first time Paul has been back in a long time. In Romans, he's very worried about it. He writes, "Pray that my offering be acceptable to the poor in Jerusalem." So he knows they might say, "Paul, we won't take it from you. We would be happy to have it, but not from you." And he knows he's in danger.
From New Testament references, it's possible to reconstruct what happened next. Paul arrived. He offered his donation as an act of fellowship, but James seems to have refused it. Then he confronted Paul with the new charge being made against him, that he was encouraging Jews to break the Torah, the Jewish law.
It wasn't simply that he was telling non-Jews they needn't keep the whole Torah. That was okay, because James was quite happy about that. That was the agreement made before, but he was going much further than that. He was telling Jews who were converted to the Jesus movement, that's the end of the Torah as you're concerned. You don't need to circumcise your children anymore. There's no need to keep the dietary laws. All that is out of date.
Paul could hardly deny the charges, but he tried to reassure James of his loyalty. Then James asked Paul to prove that he was still an observer of Jewish law by going to the temple and taking part in purification ceremonies.
Paul, nothing loath, agrees to do this, even though we know from his letters and from everything Acts has shown us that he doesn't follow the law. So Paul is embodying the philosophy he presents in 1 Corinthians, the key letter for all of these things, where he says, "I am a Greek to the Greek, a Jew to the Jew, a lawkeeper to the lawkeeper, a lawbreaker to the lawbreaker. I will do whatever I have to do to win."
While he was in the process of carrying out these purifications in the temple, he was recognized by certain Jews who said, "This is the man who has been going around telling Jews to give up the Torah." And there was a great riot. And it was at this point that Paul made his decisive move when he claimed protection on the grounds that he was a Roman citizen.
How Paul had become a Roman citizen is a mystery. In the Acts of the Apostles, he says he was born one, but it was also possible to buy citizenship. His announcement shocked many of the onlooking Jews, for whom the occupying Romans were the oppressors.
He's mobbed, and he's only rescued and extracted by Roman soldiers. They're not arresting him because they feel he's bad. They're arresting him in order to protect him from the zealot Jewish mob, among whom James seems to have been the darling.
That is the split. The moment when he says, "I am a Roman citizen," which was not known before, that is the moment of split, when he detaches himself completely from the Jerusalem church and its political aims, and he becomes the founder of a new movement.
Over the coming century, Paul and his followers would be the winners in the battle for the biography of Jesus. They would write the New Testament story. The familiar image we have of Jesus today, from Renaissance paintings to Hollywood movies, reflects Paul's perspective. There is no pictorial representation or written record of how Jesus' family and closest followers might have seen him. But if the winners had been James and the Jerusalem church, how would they have written the life of Jesus?